네, 안녕하세요. 저희 이제 7시 1분이 되어서 오늘 강연 시간 맞춰서 시작을 해보려고 합니다. Hi, Baruch. 그러면 저희 우선 몇 가지 공지사항과 프로그램 소개를 하면서 시작을 하려고 하는데요. 저는 우선 대한공간 루프에서 디렉터로 활동을 하고 있는 양지윤입니다. 그리고 지금 오늘 계시는 바루 고틀립 선생님하고 저희가 사운드 이펙트 서울이라는 사운드 아트 페스티벌을 이제 2007년부터 기획을 하고 있고요. 그래서 같이 이제 오늘 이 자리에도 초대를 드리게 되었습니다. 그리고 이 전체 프로그램을 EarthSea Study라고 되어 있고요. 올해 총 12번의 이제 강연과 워크샵이 준비되어 있습니다. 그래서 이번 주 토요일 오후에는 대한공간 루프에서 또 고틀립 선생님 같이 함께 진행하는 워크샵 진행할 예정이에요. 그래서 오늘 강연 들어보시고 관심 있으신 분들은 아직 자리가 좀 남아 있으니까 토요일 행사 신청하시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 그러면 우선은 여기 채팅방에 그 공지사항 확인해 주시면 좋을 것 같고요. 오늘 김지원 선생님이 통역 맡으셔서 선생님이 이제 화면 공유로 그 한글 텍스트 같이 보면서 바로 고틀립 선생님의 강연을 진행해 보도록 하겠습니다. Hi, Baruch. So floor is yours.
Thanks, June. Hello, and nice to see all of you here. Welcome. Thanks also to Yolam and Adam. I think maybe she was not there, but thanks to the whole Loop team for organizing this. This is the second time that we try a kind of a seminar here on one of the programs that the team is organizing. These very exciting programs. Interestingly, our interests are connecting a lot these days, so it's very nice that I'm able to contribute in a pertinent way to what's going on. Yeah, thank you very much to Jiwon for doing the translation. Also, it's a wonderful to work with you. And as June said, maybe nobody else could translate that text. So I'm very, very grateful for that, and it was a pleasure to work with you again. Thanks for helping out today also with the kind of with the visuals, right? You're going to be showing the text at the same time as I'm reading. And thank you to Jean, of course, for inviting me again.
아니요, 이거 루프에서 하는 프로그램인데 궁금해서 신청을 했는데.
I'll translate really quick.
Okay.
그래서 이번이 이제 저번에 했던 거 이제 두 번째 이렇게 세미나로 진행을 하신다고 그래서 다시 초대해 주셔서 감사하다고 이렇게 말씀을 하셨고, 이제 제가 텍스트가 좀 길어서 이렇게 화면 공유를 하고, 이제 같이 선생님의 말을 따라가면서 이렇게 내려가면서 이렇게 읽으면서 선생님 육성을 들으면서 이렇게 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. I have just a couple of other things to say before we start. So if either Jean or you are a good translator, I think that's good. Okay, so this text today comes from a series, reading circle series that I'm doing in The Hague, and I will share the URL in the channel. Let's see if we can check it out. Oops. So we're doing a reading series every month where we're looking at the text of different authors, and it's kind of an extension of a year-long project that I did last year, reading Haraway text. So we started from Haraway, and now we're looking at books. We started from the books that were on Haraway's bookshelf, and that's why it's called the Haraway bookshelf.
네, 그래서 이 텍스트는 사실 제가 그 리딩 서클 시리즈에서 계속 이렇게 연장해서 이제 계속 한 one year, 그러니까 1년 정도 넘게 이렇게 진행하고 있었고, 그리고 이제 매달 같이 이렇게 여러 저자들을 읽는 그런 시간을 가지고 있었던 그 시리즈의 연장인데, 사실 그 해러웨이 북쉘프라는 이름을 가지면서 이제 도나 해러웨이의 텍스트를 중심으로 좀 읽고 있었던 시리즈입니다.
So if you look at the link there, you'll see there's been 8 sessions already. There's 4 more going on, and there's 3 themes. And the 3 themes are the theme of today, ergo feminism. The second one is the theme of Saturday's meeting, dialectical ecology. And those 2 we've finished now. And then the third theme is called parapolitics, and we're just starting that. And that's at the end of every month. So everybody is welcome to also join those reading circles. Yeah, they happen in English. And yeah, you're welcome to join in. And it happens at 2:00 p.m. in Europe. So it's about 8:00 or 9:00 in Korea. So it's still possible.
그래서 이것이 온라인으로도 이제 조인 가능한 그런 세미나 리딩 서클이니까요. 저희가 사실은 첫 번째는 이제 에르고 페미니즘, 오늘 말할 에르고 페미니즘, 그리고 두 번째는 변증법적 생태학, 그리고 the third one was what was it?
Parapolitics.
Parapolitics. 다중 정치학에 대한 그런 이야기고 테마로 이루어져 있습니다. 그래서 이제 누구든 이제 참여하실 수 있고, 사실 이것이 유럽에서 오후 2시에 이제 진행이 되는데 한국으로는 한 8시나 9시 정도 될 것 같은데 아직 그렇기 때문에 가능할 것 같네요.
Okay, and the last thing is that this, just to warn you that this text is that I'm going to read today, very dense as usual. My texts tend to be very dense, and so I mean I'm going to stop in the middle or from time to time and to see if there are questions. But also I hope that you'll ask questions or you'll complain or whatever, react in the chat while I'm talking, or even talk, converse between each other. I mean, if you can help each other. Yeah, I'm hoping that you will feel comfortable to raise your issues or ask questions or whatever comment at any time if things are not clear, or it's too dense, or it's going too fast, or it doesn't make sense, kind of thing. And because I believe that you all have what it needs, to understand this, and you need to. Yeah. I hope you will participate.
Someone asked in the chat, like, where does the Zoom meeting, the reading circle is gonna be held?
Yeah, that every month we announce it, and but I can send the Zoom link. It's a repeating Zoom link. You can just you just have to know which Sunday it is, which day it is, and then you can do it. Maybe Jean can send around this information, right? And then you can be informed.
오케이. 줌 링크를 통해서 보내주신다고 이제 하시고요. 그리고 이제 아까 말씀하셨던 거는 이제 이번 텍스트는 항상 그랬듯이 굉장히 좀 댄스 밀도가 좀 높은 텍스트인데, 그렇기 때문에 여러분들이 이제 언제든 이제 좀 멈춰달라고 하거나 좀 더 설명이 필요한 부분이 있으면은 언제든지 좀 개입하셔도 된다고 이제 말씀을 하셨고, 그리고 좀 편안하게 언제든지 이제 챗박스에다가 이제 리액션을 많이 해달라고, 그리고 이제 편안하게 이제 여러분들의 이제 이슈에 대해서 좀 목소리를 높여달라고 하셨습니다.
Yeah, so it's not a question of me being right or me knowing something important that I have to give to you, but that we all learn together.
우리 이걸 통해서 다 같이 배우길 원한다고 하십니다.
Okay, so let's start.
Mhm.
Ready?
Okay, I'll share the
Yeah,
screen.
you can share the screen.
Is that good?
Looks good. Looks good to me. I have to leave the full screen because I have to read the whole screen. But, good. Okay, so we'll go from this essay is divided up into 5 parts. So why labor is essential for ecofeminism. So it is a contribution to ecofeminism. Why labor is essential for intersectional feminism. We're going to compare and discuss bourgeois ecofeminism, proletarian ecofeminism, and the role of men. Why anti-capitalism is not enough to produce the changes that we would like to see in the world. And the final one, we will return to this term for ecofeminism, radical intersectional ecofeminism. This essay is the second in the series that I'm currently around June's discussion program on ecofeminism and eco-socialism. The previous one, there's a video on like that. Attempting to unify the concerns towards a viable political proposal, I focused here on a central concept in socialist theory, labor. Though as many feminist scholars have observed, labor cannot comprehend the full extent of women's contribution to social reproduction. Capitalist discipline and domination over labor undergirds the hypermodern context in which I present the analysis, and also determines the horizon for resistance and revolution. So though it is not sufficient, a focus on labor can be politically efficient. As Cynthia Cockburn in her article on standpoint theory, I will return to below, cites Kathy Weeks. If we take laboring practices rather than signifying practices as our point of entry into these configurations of gendered subjectivity, we can better account for the coercion under which gender is embodied.
Hi, Baruch. Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt.
Yeah.
Your sound is not really clear.
Oh, okay.
Put your speaker closer to your mouth.
Mouth?
Yeah.
Yeah. How is this? Is this better? Or should I just use my internal mic? I can take out my microphone.
This is a lot better now.
This is a lot better? Okay. Should I start over? Or it's okay?
It's okay for now.
Yeah. I'll start over the Kathy Weeks scope.
Yeah. Thank you.
If we take laboring practices, thank you for the interruption, by the way. Good to know. So, yeah, if we take laboring practices rather than signifying practices as our point of entry into these configurations of gendered subjectivity, we can better account for the coercion under which gender is embodied. Few would mistake labor for a practice that can be freely taken up or easily refused. Thus, by privileging labor, we are better able to keep sight of the constitutive links between systematic socioeconomic relations on the one hand and collective modes of practice and forms of subjectivity on the other. So this quote deserves a whole discussion. Maybe we can return to it if you like. All value comes from labor. This is not an idea from Marx, but one which is often associated with Marx with the term labor theory of value. Marx never used this term because during his lifetime, there was only one theory of value, developed by the classical economists, David Ricardo and Adam Smith, among others, who held that economic value, that is, something of value to human beings, was produced through the encounter of human beings and nature. That nature alone did not have value, again, as a social economic concept, without it being converted in some way. Marx says, mixing their labor with it. into something of use to human beings. That is why the classical economists, including Marx, that is what the classical economists, including Marx, referred to as value. So this encounter of human beings and nature, appropriating nature for human needs. Marx's famous work, Capital, is not meant to be a political polemic. It is Marx's idea of a scientific textbook introduction to the economics of capitalism. That is why it's so full of laborious descriptions of the productive process, and why it is not exactly the most readable text. Because Capital is uniquely concerned with how capitalism works, the term value used there is related to capitalist production methods. Use value are the materials which are used in production, and surplus value is value extracted from the productive process, especially labor, made possible by the historical process of proletarianization, where capitalists and landowners cooperated to drive the peasants off the land into the cities. The resulting people, whose old working methods and tools were rendered useless, were radically liberated by capitalism to compete with each other, with their fellow proletarian, on the free market to sell their labor to capitalists. Capitalism extracts from this free labor all of its profits or surplus value. In the capitalist system, labor produces all commodities on which all human beings survive, and all the profits are split between businessmen and landowners. The way the capitalist system is narrowly described in Capital, what is today referred to as reproductive labor in the home, is not considered to produce value, not because it doesn't produce anything worthy, but because it is not directly exploited by capital. The house worker is understood in Capital to be exploited through their working spouse in the workforce. Both the home worker and the spouse are exploited and paid a salary through the body of the worker laboring directly for capital, these so-called forces of production. Labor is still today the source of all capitalist value. And as socialist theory developed through the experiences of the 20th century, feminist theory began to attend carefully to labor as a realm of struggle and contradiction, not only within capitalism, but within all societies. The liberation of women required economic autonomy. This required a focus and an elevation of the category of what is conventionally considered woman's work. As we discussed in last session, the economic autonomy for women can be afforded in many different ways. With the phrase, "women keep the world alive," Sylvia Federici begins her essay, "Women, Land Struggles, and the Valorization of Labor." The assertion reappears throughout her writing in various forms. The message is not new, but the implications are worth re-stressing. Nothing in the world, in the hypermodern world of just-in-time services, where globalized production is coordinated through vast arrays of surveillance and logistics infrastructure, would happen without unpaid care labor in the home, but also in the workplace, chiefly undertaken by women. As Carolyn Marvin recounts in When Old Technologies Were New, women at work help soothe the male workers who are in a constant state of uncertainty and disruption-based super exploitation through technology-led changes in the work environment. Marvin recounts how women play a pivotal role, bridging procedural ruptures, which occur regularly in the constantly disruptive work environment. Women are exploited not only for their productive labor, but additionally for their emotional labor and social ingenuity, without which the productivity increases expected with the introduction of new technology and new methods would not occur. Feminism is strongly associated with the liberation of women to join the workforce, as Bell Hooks notes, to work at jobs which men already paid. But besides this rather narrow doorway open for women's social mobility in the white-collar world, Hooks notes that the vast majority of women already work, besides doing housework, doing menial low-paid jobs with no social status. In a world where the majority is condemned to work tirelessly without any hope of accession to a higher realm of the hegemony, Joy James's concept of the captive maternal explains how mainly women need to prepare their children to succeed in a world they themselves cannot accept, but from which they and their children will likely never escape. Captive maternals are captive in every layer of society, helping society reproduce itself despite its violent injustice in the interest of their progeny. Engels notes that with the defeat of matrilinearity and the mother right, women became the first slaves, subordinated to the needs of the household as part of the genesis of the institution of private property. Quote from Engels, "The overthrow of the mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command of the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. He became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children." The word household means economy. Echo, the house, nomos, the rules. Echo, nomos, economy. Angela Davis, in Women, Race, and Class, provides a history of the centrality of women's labor, especially Black women's labor, to the relative bounty of the European project called development, which it has enjoyed until today. Even in a slave community, women cannot but work extra to make life livable, directly for their families and indirectly for the economy in general. Silvia Federici's term, reproductive labor, is most eloquent in this sense. Hypermodernity is reproduced through the feminine labor, or feminized labor, unpaid at home and super extracted at work. Were women to withdraw this unpaid surplus contribution to society, the entire economy would instantly be shaken to its knees. And we discussed that last time, having a woman's strike. But this doesn't happen because it's not so easy. Most work women do is not voluntary, it is essential. To withdraw this domestic care work in the home means the end of the home. Families, Bell Hooks notes in the feminist theory from margin to center, are, especially for working men, no mere domain of patriarchal tyranny, but a bastion of support on which they can build and build on. Hooks is so helpful here in her insistence that the interests of women can only be effectively fought for by building class alliances also with men and in families. Hooks insists on doing everything to improve family relations in the household, including building solidarity with working men. Intersectional feminism means the rights of bourgeois feminists are also served when working men also thrive, not individually, but as a class. So this is a controversial point for secondary feminists. That intersectional feminism, I'll say it again, means that the rights of bourgeois feminists and bourgeois women are also served when working men also thrive, not individually, but as a class. Davis affirms that even under slavery, the family remained one of the inalienable bastions of women's support and revolutionary potential for women, men, and their children. Now quote Angela Davis. In the infinite anguish of ministering to the needs of the men and children around her, she was performing the only labor of the slave community which could not be directly and immediately claimed by the oppressor. There was no compensation for work in the fields. It served no useful purpose for the slaves. Domestic labor was the only meaningful labor for the slave community as a whole. Precisely through performing the drudgery, which has long been a central expression of the socially conditioned inferiority of women, the Black woman in chains would help to lay the foundation for some degree of autonomy, both for herself and her men. Even as she was suffering under her unique oppression as female, she was thrust into the center of the slave community. She was therefore essential to the survival of the community. Hooke's advances an ergo-feminist intersectionality, an understanding that women's work, paid and unpaid, acknowledged and unacknowledged, is vital for the reproduction of society at its most elemental level. That the victimization of women is tied up in the subordination of labor to the feudal capitalist system, which extracts maximally from women, men, and all life. Only in the recognition of this common condition, and not in isolating women as especially victimized, will the violent suppression, subordination, and exploitation be undone. Unity in victimhood can help bring people together, but the radical emancipation of women, the flourishing of their talents and their abilities, and the transformation of the world out of patriarchal capitalism will require going beyond the victim identity. Here's a quote from Bell Hooks. Women are enriched when we bond with one another, but we cannot develop sustaining ties or political solidarity using the model of sisterhood created by bourgeois women's liberationists. According to their analysis, the basis for bonding was shared victimization, hence the emphasis on common oppression. This concept of bonding directly reflects male supremacist thinking. Sexist ideology teaches women that to be female is to be a victim. Rather than reproduce this equation, which mystifies the female experience in their daily lives, most women are not continually passive, helpless, or powerless victims. Women's liberationists embraced it. So rather than repudiate this equation, women's liberationists embraced it, making shared victimization the basis for women bonding. This meant that women had to conceive of themselves as victims in order to feel that feminist movement was relevant to their lives. Bonding as victims created a situation in which assertive, self-affirming women were often seen as having no place in the feminist movement. It was this logic that led white women activists, along with Black men, to suggest that Black women were so strong they did not need to be active in feminist movement. It was this logic that led many white women activists to abandon feminist movement when they no longer embraced the victim identity. Ironically, the women who were most eager to be seen as victims, who overwhelmingly stressed the role of victim, were more privileged and powerful than the vast majority of women in our society. An example of this tendency is some writing about violence against women. Women who are exploited and oppressed daily cannot afford to relinquish the belief that they exercise some measure of control, however relative, over their lives. They cannot afford to see themselves solely as victims because their survival depends on continued exercise of whatever personal powers they possess. It would be psychologically demoralizing for these women to bond with other women on the basis of shared victimization. They bond with other women on the basis of shared strengths and resources. This is the woman bonding feminist movement should encourage. Ruth Schwartz Cohen's more work for mother shows how technological progress has not meant less work for women, but more work, more fragmented and alienated work. Has not meant less work for women, but more work, more fragmented and alienated work. In recompense, women, especially bourgeois women, were expected to develop their femininity. The book describes how, as the household became more dependent on goods which were produced at industrial scale, far from home, the division between men and women's role in the house became sharper. Whereas men and women formerly worked together, both connected to the reproduction of household life, for example, the man milking the cow and the woman making butter. Today, the men earn money to purchase commodities, and the women try to stitch together a livable life based on these commodities. While men became increasingly alienated, not only from their work, but from home life, the woman was expected to constrain all her talents and concerns to the home. Bell Hooks notes that women's liberation movement increasingly meant that upper-class women were hiring other women to take over vital reproductive labor so they would be able to realize their liberation. In other words, women's liberation was the perpetuation of capitalist oppression through women. This, noted by Hooks, Davis, and countless others, has driven an important rift between bourgeois and other feminisms, with the former tending to be increasingly anti-revolutionary. With bourgeois feminism came the cult of femininity. Women were expected to be both mothers and ladies, to develop traits not related to their practical ability, knowledge, and experience, but to aesthetic pursuits which please men, but not to work. Midway in the first industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century, economist Thorstein Veblen noted how women's fashion, long hair, high heels, and tight skirts, were accused that these women were supposedly unfit for work. 20th century feminism's vision of these women who are emancipated through work is ideally an executive whose work is intellectual and creative, managerial or executive class, not that of the vast majority of working women. This condition is intensifying and spread a class split between women and disrupted the solidarity between classes of women. Angela Davis fills in where Cohen leaves off, asserting that the bourgeois femininity is reproduced by slave women labor on the plantation, both in the fields as work animals, as well as breeders, producing and grooming the labor force for the bourgeois feminist class. And here's Angela Davis. As the ideology of femininity, a byproduct of industrialization, was popularized and disseminated through new ladies' magazines and romantic novels, white women came to be seen as inhabitants of a sphere totally severed from the realm of productive work. This cleavage between the home and the public economy brought on by industrial capitalism established female inferiority more firmly than ever before. Women became synonymous in the prevailing propaganda with mother and housewife, and both mother and housewife bore the fatal mark of inferiority. But among Black female slaves, this vocabulary was nowhere to be found. The economic arrangements of slavery contradicted the hierarchical sexual roles incorporated in the new ideology. Male-female relations within the slave community could not therefore conform to the dominant ideological pattern. So this is pointing to, so that's in this brilliant passage, Davis provides us with a scathing critique of bourgeois femininity, both in its inexorable beholdenness to forms of slavery and colonial oppression, and also a notion of a parallel reality where there is no radical inferiority of women. The kind of mobility of global North bourgeois women is doubly constrained on one side by how it reproduces the division between the sexes, from which the patriarchy continues to have the upper hand. And on the other hand, its dependence on a kind of patriarchal and supremacist command on the productivity of the global South, and the class rupture with the women who reproduce modernity there. South Korean hypermodernism is colonial to the second degree, through being occupied by the United States. A ultra-wealthy dynastic comprador class rules South Korea with all the gangster, thuggish, might makes right of its paterfamilias, of the father of the family, the US. South Korean prosperity is earned as a cut in the racket of US hegemony. Its prevailing conservatism reflects that of its masters. French feminist Antoinette Fouque states, feminists are a bourgeois avant-garde that maintains in an inverted form the dominant values. Inversion does not facilitate the passage to another kind of structure. Reformism suits everyone. Bourgeois order, capitalism, phallocentrism are ready to integrate as many feminists as will be necessary. As a response, Fouque cites Celestine Ware, who in her Woman Power, the Movement for Women's Liberation, wrote under the heading Goals, radical feminism is working for the eradication of domination and elitism in all human relationships. This would mean self-determination, the ultimate good. This would make self-determination the ultimate good and require the downfall of society as we know it today. There is a patriarchal feminism, which continues gender conservatism, class stratification, and imperial hegemony. And there are radical feminisms, which work to transform and improve the prospects not only for all women, but for all human and non-human beings. Okay, I think we can stop for a second there. I don't know where we are. Next, we are about halfway, I guess. Anybody want to send one? Should I just continue? I was talking for 27
혹시
minutes.
질문이나 코멘트나 지금 저희 미리 이야기를 드렸지만 올려주셨듯이 이게 텍스트가 많은 텍스트들이 굉장히 차곡차곡 쌓여있는 내용들이어서 생각을 좀 하면서 넘어가야 되는 부분도 당연히 있다고 저도 생각을 하기 때문에 저희 뭐 어떻게 궁금하신 점이나 뭐 의견들 좀 채팅방에 올려주시겠어요?
I'm going to get to what's politically at stake. Well, this is maybe if you don't, you just let me know. You can go to this finish and then you can talk about it.
Berg, your sound is also breaking again.
Sorry, I have to hold
Yes.
this close to my head.
So it's like a half of a.
We're about halfway, and we're going to get to, there's like a little bit more about class distinction, and then I'm going to say something about why anti-capitalism is not enough to, liberate ourselves, and then I will wrap it up.
저희가 지금 한 절반쯤 뮤트 아니죠 지금? 네, 절반쯤 와 있는데 이제 이 이후부터는 좀 계급 구별의 문제야 이제 반자본주의의 가치로서는 왜 그게 충분하지 않은지 그 얘기를 좀 더 하면서 마무리를 한다고 하십니다. Okay.
Yeah, ergofeminism, that's Canadian pronunciation. Ergo is it recognizes all value comes from labor. Ergon, to work, it's Greek. Without this labor, all hypermodernity would collapse at once. Yet it is difficult to envisage political action which would summarily address the abysmal condition under which the vast majority of such labor takes place, for fear of radically disrupting social reproduction, and for fear of the wrath of the patriarchy, which would come down on such efforts. A revolutionary feminist today must engage with the seriousness of this contradiction and examine what modalities of struggle may still be available to militate with her sisters in the global South. The only way to ensure their own elevation, that means the bourgeois feminists, is to ensure the rise of the productive masses. Silvia Federici's praxis is unusual in feminist theory in how it's implacably grounded in women's lived experience, both here in the imperial core, but also, importantly, in the developing world. A socialist feminist agenda will need to attend to and be informed by the conditions of women in the most impoverished and most exploited countries, as Federici's does and is. In most places in the global north, a radical feminist militancy must be informed by attending to the conditions of the worse off women in that society. Incarcerated women, migrant women, the working and unemployed poor, elderly women. It is vital to see that the conditions of all women will only be consummately addressed by the elevation of the baseline of women. It is those women emancipated from the dead end of a life of struggle without exit who can best lead the struggle for full women's emancipation in society. That is not to say that there is nothing bourgeois women can do among their own class. Bourgeois women have increasing agency at the upper echelons of culture and media and government and can transform public discourse. Discussions such as this one are necessary to help find the words and make space to describe and compare one's own experiences and find commonalities, to read together and discuss observations of the past and present, take lessons and understand what challenges are the most vital to actively address, develop methods for intensifying and improving militancy within their own class. Class consciousness is not the end, it's the beginning. And what would be the demand? Socialism? It's not a question of being right, it's a question of how to live. It's not a question of whether poverty and desperation are acceptable for oneself or for others, but the fact that the poor and desperate are central to successful women's liberation movement. As Paulo Freire teaches in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, oppressors cannot free themselves. They can only be freed by the oppressed as a function of their own emancipation. It is only the oppressed who, this is Paulo Freire, it is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others or themselves. It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught, and the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of Freire always uses man, of the new human, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but human in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of the contradiction by simply changing words. So the oppressed cannot emancipate themselves, cannot liberate themselves by reversing rules with the oppressor. Feminist standpoint theory asserts that attending to the standpoints of oppressed people is essential but not sufficient for feminist liberation. Sandra Harding argues strongly for the socially contingent status of knowledge, that knowledge is produced locally by socially conditioned actors, but such knowledge must contribute to common liberatory knowledge project to radically change social conditions. This formulation is explained. So Sandra Harding argues, so standpoint theory emphasizes the standpoint of particular experience. For example, women's experience, women's labor experience. And that's essential, but not enough. And that it has to find commonalities, common liberatory project. And I'll quote Sandra Harding. This logic of multiple subjects leads to the recognition that the subject of liberatory feminist knowledge must also be, in an important and controversial sense, the subject of every other liberatory knowledge project. This is true in the collective sense of subject of knowledge, for since lesbian, poor, and racially marginalized women are all women, all feminists will have to grasp how gender, race, class, and sex are used to construct each other. It will have to do so if feminism is to be liberatory for marginalized women, but also if it is to avoid deluding the dominant group women about our own situations. If this were not so, there would be no way to distinguish between feminism and the narrow self-interest of dominant group women. Just as conventional androcentric thought permits no criterion for distinguishing between best benefits and those that serve the self-interest of men as men. Bourgeois thought permits no criterion for identifying specifically bourgeois self-interest. Racist thought for identifying racist self-interest, for example. The bourgeois thought permits no criterion for identifying specifically bourgeois self-interest. Racist thought provides no criterion for identifying racist self-interest. But the subject of every other liberatory movement must also learn how gender, race, class, and sexuality are used to construct each other in order to accomplish these goals. That is, analyses of class relations must look at their agendas from the perspective of women's lives too. So this is a radical intersectional. Harding's understanding compels a contestation of the political status of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, as being determined by, serving, and legitimizing the constituency in power. It is vital to change this constituency in order to fulfill the emancipatory agenda of feminism and ecofeminism. What is really standing in the way of this agenda? In what follows, I will lay out a structural analysis of what impedes all activist movement, including those led by women, from overcoming patriarchy and its world-dominating instrument of imperialist capitalism. Without immediate possibility to address political, social, and economic injustice directly, many activists have come to advocate raising consciousness. But ideas do not change conditions. Conditions change ideas. Only by transforming the material basis for the reproduction of political subjects can the kinds of ideas which will contribute to full emancipation emerge. Marx and Engels observed that the disenfranchised proletariat has the most profound experience of capitalist alienation, so their experience should inform revolutionary movement. Extending from this, through feminist standpoint theory, Cynthia Cockburn asserts that the consciousness of women's experience can be even more revolutionary, as capitalism operates not merely as a mode of production, but as an instrument of patriarchy. To quote Heidi Hartman, a set of social relations that has a material base and in which there are hierarchical relationships between men and solidarity among them, which enable them to, in turn, to dominate women. The material base of patriarchy is men's control over women's labor power. So we're at, but capitalism is not the whole story, right? We just finished the comment. Okay. But capitalism is not the whole story. What radically connects the concerns of Federici, Hooks, and Davis, and what is missing in bourgeois histories like that of Cohen, is the understanding of how institutions of private life, based since its inception in slavery, still functions to maintain patriarchal capitalism against all resistance. It is vital to recognize that in calling the current age merely capitalist, we are missing a vital part of the story, that the form of capitalist production which dominates today, where huge corporations come to dominate markets and capitalists through economic power can influence government to enhance their advantage, can only exist because of another, often ignored mode of power, ownership of private title, what is called the feudal mode. In Capital, Volume 3, Marx describes how the feudal mode acts as a symbiotic parasite in what is called capitalism. Real estate, for example, acts as a tax on capitalist profits, imposing what is called rent on capitalists and workers alike. Rents are payments excised through mere legal title. Copyright and patents also give the holder the right to extract rent from productive activities undertaken by others. Rents are always passive income, which accrue merely by virtue of holding the title. The more production goes on in a society, the more rent. This class of rent extraction is called by Marx the feudal mode. It is the feudal mode which stands behind, beside, and within the capitalists to keep the current prevalent imperialist system in place. Hereditary feudalism was not destroyed by bourgeois revolutions. It was democratized. Feudal institutions such as land ownership, title, but also a huge swath of new forms of intellectual property have been created to parasite off capitalist production and maintain a second power base independent of capitalism. Most capitalists today are not truly capitalists who only wish to compete with each other to innovate freely and develop the best means of producing the needs of the people most efficiently, producing what the people need more efficiently. Today's capitalists have capitalist false consciousness. They want to be, and often are, feudals who use their super profits. Through their super profits, they can extract through their title to influence the market to their advantage. The result is inefficient businesses with massive profits and periodic boom and bust cycles, which work like a pump to suck out the vital contributions of the proletariat. This is not merely capitalism, where producers compete and thrive or fail depending on their wits and ability. This is market feudalism, where an ownership class determines the rules of the game to their advantage. And this works globally. Lenin had a word for this: imperialism. The reason it is so difficult to get policies like universal health care, elder care, child care, pension, subsidized housing, etc., implemented in most countries is not because the capitalists don't want it. It is because the market feudalists don't want it. In order to carry out such reforms, which would inordinately lift the burden off proletarian women and emancipate them not only for their own development, but also for international solidarity and militancy, the feudal mode and its dictatorship of the bourgeoisie must be submitted to the discipline of a higher authority which represents proletarian interests, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat.
In ecological, environmental feminist movements, the enemy is often described as capitalism or growth, but it is the feudal mode that perpetuates and defends the violently dangerous forms capitalist technological development and growth, which are destroying people and the biosphere today. That is what makes the difference between capitalism in China and capitalism in South Korea or Europe. In China, the feudal and capitalist modes are able to function and generate economic power, but not political power. They are kept subordinate to the discipline of the Communist Party of China. Because the CPC, the Communist Party of China, intervenes on the market to break up uncompetitive monopolies, which imperil the efficiency of the market or otherwise imperil the common good, one can say, in some way, that the competition between capitalists is even more free in China than in so-called capitalist countries. And perhaps, as the genius of oppressed proletarian and poor women in those countries is emancipated and provided the agency to transform policy which affects women and which opens up radically new forms of liberation, not only for women, but for men as well. So capitalism alone is not the enemy, and anti-capitalism is not enough. Ecofeminists need to subordinate not only the capitalist mode, but also the feudal mode to their discipline. And this will require that the proletariat, women and men, are on board. Bourgeois feminist reform has accomplished a lot. There are more women in positions of power, and the general appreciation for women in society has improved. But this bourgeois revolution, like those before it, has at once carved out a new autonomy for their constituency, women, while leaving much of the power structure which undergirds this autonomy intact, the feudal mode. The democratic deficit, which keeps radical feminist reform perpetually on the defensive instead of in command, is rooted in who materially has sovereignty over the forces of production and reproduction. Bourgeois societies propagate the ideology that government is war, and the violent war games of the feudal oligarchy are and should be the ineluctable natural evil of the governing class. Proletarian societies believe that it is possible to govern through radically inclusive consultative structures, and that the drudgery of managing such vast consultative apparatus is an acceptable trade-off for the general emancipation of human capacities and the stability and peace which would ensue. As mentioned above, Marx and Engels considered the proletariat the most advanced class, since it has the most direct experience of the process of social reproduction under capitalist alienation. If the proletariat are so advanced, then proletarian women, former slaves and colonized people, are even more advanced, with more historical experience of the violent disruption of technological advance under capitalist exploitation. These women proletarians and former slaves should inform any revolutionary program which aspires to deliver humanity from its most urgent concerns. As we will see in the next session, we're almost finished. I think we have like 5 paragraphs left. So I'll just continue to the end, if that's okay. As we will see in the next session, with regard to the environmental crisis, we can go even deeper, as Stefania Barca explores in Forces of Reproduction, applying ergo-feminism to the biosphere. The work of the biosphere may be seen as the ur-proletariat, the original proletariat. We never asked wheat or cows if they wanted to be domesticated to serve human progress. But here we have a problem of democratic representation. We have no direct access to most of the inhabitants of the biosphere. We cannot talk directly to wheat or cows. Rather, human beings must perform as avatars for them, human being is, and individual human beings are, part of the biosphere. Ecology, without this class analysis, diverges into green feudalism or reactionary countermodernism. The telos of science, knowledge, and reason is communism. But communism, as a project of human being, is itself in a dialectical relationship with the material planetary condition of the planet. So communism will never be an end in itself, but a form of perpetual practice of experimentation and learning at planetary scale. The work of the biosphere, represented in our own bodily processes, which transcend ourselves, are represented in human politics, whether we like it or they like it or not. The feminist dimension is developed radically by Stefania Barca, citing Marxist ecofeminist Mary Mallour as the underlaboring work that women do that is incorporated into the material world of man, as represented in the theoretical framework of historical materialism. Understanding that human thriving and freedom comes from labor, and understanding that biological production happening in the infra, within our bodies, own biome, social at the human scale, and meta at the managerial scale or governmental scale, and transbiospheric interoperativity are how we treat each other is how we treat each other is how we treat the biosphere. All value is produced by human labor, even today, and biosphere labor, inherent to and represented in human labor, is the source of the vast wealth of the feudal hegemon. Other than that necessary for human being to subsist, surplus value is extracted and sequestered and used against the proletariats to maintain the hegemony over this hoard. The hoard itself has no value except socially. This means that the hegemon must allow the subordinated base proletariat to reproduce, which, through socially necessary production, reproduces meaning itself for themselves, which is also usurped by the hegemon. Now, it should be clear that intersectional feminists who have the well-being of the global womanhood as their prime objective cannot be imperialist. They must support the mothers and sisters in the developing world, especially, as Federici always takes pains to point out, when it comes to ownership or sovereignty over land. It is not enough to struggle for workers' rights if the land on which one labors remains an unchallenged right to control and extract. Ergofeminism, therefore, also means supporting indigenous and peasant women's land struggles. Additionally, it is important to understand what is at stake at places where revolution of some kind, proletarian revolution of some kind, has already occurred, and the power of the ownership class, the feudal mode, is being brought under the discipline of the state for the benefit of the generality. The subordination of the feudal mode is a massive load off the shoulders of working men and women. The new cultures emancipated from vast populations of working women and men who no longer have to slave for rent are only barely emergent today in those societies where a revolution has taken place. These experiments are not perfect, will not be perfect, and should be subjected to the same critique attended on exploitative capitalist economies, but they should also be cherished for attempting to realize unprecedentedly more just conditions, especially for women. The bourgeois in those societies will protest strongly and colorfully. They will make art, hip-hop, and theater about their oppression. They will make movies and TV series with heroic alienated women in bittersweet beach sunsets. They will assert the truth of individual suffering against the truth of collective suffering and privilege the former. Bourgeois culture exists in the contradiction between individual and collective needs, privileging the former. proletarian culture balances out this dialectic. So the institutions of art and culture will be transformed in a society which emancipates women's potential. And the bourgeois art forms of before will have to find a new place. Success of any socialist project depends on unlocked collaborative human genius on a massive scale. It depends not only on opportunity, but on the time and freedom to participate at leisure. The changes most socialists want must be informed by emancipated working women, the most advanced of the most advanced class. So I ended there with working women as being having the most direct experience of exploitation under capitalism, and therefore having the most important or relevant knowledge or experience to guide a revolutionary process, which will emancipate not only all women, but all women and men.
네, 가장 착취당하고 가장 억압당한 여성들에 대해 그들의 노동에 대해서 좀 집중해서 네, 그 부분이 어떤 우리 사회의 어떤 재생산과 관련된다는 부분을 좀 강조하고자 하였습니다.
Yeah, so it's through the emancipation of the lowest level of reproductive labor that we will be emancipated. Everybody will be emancipated, right?
네, 그들의 해방이 곧 우리 모두의 해방과 관련이 있다. 네, 이렇게 마무리 주실 수 있겠습니다.